My entitled family wants to take my house and give it to my brother, even though they kicked me out of their home because they had no space for me. It all started when I bought my first house, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood. I worked tirelessly for years to save up enough for a down payment. The day I moved in was one of the happiest of my life. I had finally accomplished what many people in my family thought was impossible, especially considering the difficulties I had faced growing up. I was proud of the home I built, and it symbolized independence. Little did I know, my family was already planning to tear it all down. My brother Ryan was always the golden child. He was the one who could do no wrong in the eyes of my parents. While I struggled to find my place, Ryan was handed opportunities left and right. So when I purchased the house, I thought it would be a way for me to finally show them I could succeed on my own. But even after all my hard work, my parents didn't seem to acknowledge it. They were still wrapped up in Ryan's world. Over the years, the family dynamics became more strained. I stopped visiting as much, not because I didn't love them, but because I began to realize that my accomplishments weren't celebrated by anyone other than me. Every visit felt like a reminder of how little I mattered in the grand scheme of things. But nothing prepared me for the day they demanded I give up my house. It began with a casual conversation one evening. My parents invited me over for dinner, and we sat around the table like we used to. Everything seemed normal at first, until my mom mentioned that Ryan was struggling with his rent and could use a place to stay. I didn't think much of it. Ryan had always bounced around between different places, and I figured this was just another one of his phases. But then my dad dropped a bombshell: "You should think about giving Ryan your house." I was taken aback. My house? The one I worked so hard for? My dad went on to explain that Ryan had potential but needed a stable place to live in order to focus on his future. I tried to remain calm, asking how they could even think of asking me for something like that. But my parents seemed to brush off my concerns, as if it was a simple and logical request. They claimed that I had been blessed with a home, and that I could always find another place to live if I wanted to. They even suggested that it would be a family favor for me to give up the house and help my brother. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The audacity of it all. Not only had they never asked me for any help, but now they were demanding I sacrifice everything for Ryan. I told them I wasn't giving up my home, and the conversation ended on a tense note. But I had no idea this was just the beginning. The next few weeks were nothing short of a nightmare. Every time I spoke to my parents, they brought up the house. "Have you thought about what we discussed?" my dad would ask, acting as if it was a simple favor between family members. My mom, ever the emotional manipulator, would start telling me how disappointed she was in me for not helping out my brother. It became unbearable. What really stung was how my parents tried to guilt-trip me. They'd remind me of all the sacrifices they made for me growing up, how they supported me when I was younger. But those were different times. They never once acknowledged how I had to fend for myself later in life. I had worked hard to get to where I was, and the idea of just handing over my house was beyond insulting.
As if the pressure from my parents wasn't enough, Ryan started calling me as well. He'd tell me how hard things were for him, how he couldn't afford rent, how he needed a place to stay. At first, I tried to be understanding, but after a while it started feeling less like concern for him and more like manipulation. Ryan never seemed to take responsibility for his own problems. Instead, he always expected others to solve them for him. And now, he was asking me to give up my life's work so he could have an easy way out.
The pressure continued to mount. My mom began showing up unannounced at my house, bringing up the topic of Ryan's situation every time. "I just want you to think about it," she would say, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. It felt like an emotional siege, and it was taking a toll on my mental health. Every time I turned around, there they were, my parents, my brother, pushing the same narrative: my house was no longer mine, it was meant to be Ryan's. One evening, my mom even mentioned that they could help me find a new place to live. I gave up my house. But the suggestion felt hollow. It wasn't about me finding a new place, it was about them forcing me to make a sacrifice for Ryan. The fact that they didn't even consider my feelings was hurtful. I had worked my entire life for this home, and now they were treating it as if it was just a piece of property to be handed around. At that point, I had no choice but to set boundaries. I told my parents that I wouldn't be discussing the house anymore, that I needed space. But this only angered them more. My dad began accusing me of being selfish, and my mom called me cold-hearted. I couldn't believe this was happening. Why did it feel like my family was more invested in my brother's convenience than my own happiness? Ryan, as always, took the passive route, pretending to be the victim in all of this. He started sending me messages asking when I'd be ready to hand over the house. He didn't say it in so many words, but the tone was clear. He expected me to just give it to him because he needed it. He kept referring to my home as though it were never really mine, as if I had simply been a temporary occupant of the property that was destined for him. His sense of entitlement was maddening. Over the years I had watched him struggle and fail, only to be bailed out again and again. But none of those bailouts had ever come from me. So, when Ryan started hinting that he would be so much better off in my house, I had to laugh bitterly. He had never demonstrated any responsibility in his life. He was the kind of person who would destroy a good thing just because it was handed to him without effort. And yet, here he was, asking for the one thing I had worked my entire life to build. I tried to have a conversation with him about what this meant for me, but he was dismissive. "It's just a house. You can get another one," he said with a shrug. The arrogance in his voice made my blood boil. He didn't understand the sacrifice I had made to get here, nor did he care. All he saw was an easy opportunity. But there was no way I was going to let him take what I had built with my own 2 hands. Things began to escalate quickly. The rest of my family seemed to fall in line with my parents' views. My aunt, who had always been supportive of me, started making passive-aggressive comments during family gatherings. "It's just a house," she would say, with that same tone of judgment my parents had adopted. "Family is more important than property. Don't you think?" It was like they were all brainwashed into thinking that my success was theirs for the taking. I tried explaining to my relatives that my situation was different. I didn't have a backup plan. I couldn't just afford to give up everything I had worked for. But they didn't want to hear it. My cousins, who had always admired me, started looking at me like I was the villain in this story. The divide in the family grew deeper, and I began to feel more isolated than ever. The people who were supposed to support me were now the ones pressuring me to make a sacrifice that would destroy everything I had worked for.
It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about my value as a person. If I gave in to their demands, it would feel like I was saying that I didn't matter, that my hard work and achievements were insignificant. I couldn't let that happen. But every time I tried to defend myself, it felt like I was speaking into a void. My family didn't seem to care about my feelings, my sacrifices, or my future.
One evening, my parents made their final push. They called me to a family meeting, where they laid out their offer. They told me that they had talked to a lawyer and that, with the right paperwork, they could make the transition of ownership smooth for everyone. My mom was practically pleading with me, her voice trembling with false concern. "You know this is for Ryan's future," she said, as if that somehow made it easier to swallow. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They had already taken it upon themselves to plan how the house would be transferred, as if they had the right to do so. They didn't even ask if I wanted to be part of the conversation. It wasn't just about them wanting Ryan to have my house anymore. It was about them taking control of my life, my decisions, and my belongings without any regard for my feelings. I told them, flatly, that I wasn't giving up my house. The silence in the room was deafening. My parents' faces fell and I could see the disappointment in their eyes. But I wasn't going to back down. I had reached my breaking point, and there was no way I was going to let them take everything from me. I walked out of that meeting feeling like I had just made the most important decision of my life. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of an even bigger battle. The fallout was immediate and brutal. The next day, my parents started calling me, demanding that I reconsider my decision. They played every card in the emotional deck. My mom cried on the phone, telling me how heartbroken she was that I wasn't helping Ryan. My dad, on the other hand, was cold and angry, telling me that I was being selfish and ungrateful. He reminded me of everything they had done for me growing up, and how I owed it to the family to help Ryan now. Ryan, predictably, took a passive-aggressive approach. He sent me a long, guilt-ridden message claiming that I was ruining his future by refusing to help him. He called me selfish and mean-spirited for not giving him the opportunity to get on his feet in my house. The more I read these messages, the more I realized that they had no idea what it was like to work for something and see it treated as expendable. This wasn't just about a house, it was about their complete lack of respect for me and my efforts.
As the days passed, the pressure only grew. I began receiving texts and emails from extended family members, all of them echoing the same sentiment: I was in the wrong. My cousins, who had once admired me, now judged me harshly for not helping out. Even friends who I had confided in began to question my decision. The weight of it all was suffocating. It felt like I was the villain in a story I never agreed to be part of, but I knew deep down that I couldn't give in.
As the weeks passed, the pressure didn't let up. It soon became clear that my parents were not going to give up. They began to subtly suggest that maybe it would be best if I moved out of the area entirely, so Ryan could have the house. My mom even mentioned that there were plenty of other houses around for me to buy. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They were not only trying to take my home, but they were also trying to erase me from the picture entirely, as if my existence was an inconvenience. It didn't end there. My parents started spreading rumors about me to other family members, trying to turn them against me. They told everyone that I was being difficult, and that I had too much pride to help my brother. They painted me as the selfish one, the person who cared more about property than family. Meanwhile, Ryan played the role of the innocent victim who was just trying to get his life together. It became clear that my family was in full-on damage control mode. They were working overtime to make sure I would be seen as the villain in this scenario. The more I resisted, the more they twisted the narrative to make it look like I was the one causing trouble. It was a full-fledged campaign to make me look bad, and I had no idea how to stop it. The only thing I knew for sure was that I couldn't give in. The emotional toll of the situation began to eat away at me. I started withdrawing from social events, isolating myself from people I had once called friends. The constant barrage of guilt-tripping, manipulation, and insults from my family felt unbearable. Every time I left the house, I felt the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. The idea that my home, my sanctuary, wasn't truly mine was maddening.
One afternoon, I broke down. I was alone in my house, sitting on the couch, when it hit me. The pressure from my family had become too much. The constant arguing, the cruel remarks, the emotional manipulation, I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted to walk away from it all, to pack up and leave. But I knew that doing so would mean giving in. If I gave up now, I would never be able to reclaim my sense of self.
I spent the next few days reflecting, trying to find the strength to face my family. I knew this wasn't going to be easy. They weren't going to just let it go, and the emotional scars would last far beyond the conflict itself. But I also knew that if I didn't stand my ground now, I would regret it for the rest of my life. This wasn't just about the house, it was about me asserting my worth and fighting for my place in the world. I decided to have one last conversation with my parents, hoping to clear the air once and for all. I invited them over to my house, where we could sit down and talk without distractions. The meeting was tense from the start. My mom immediately started in with her usual emotional tactics, telling me how much it hurt her that I wasn't supporting Ryan. "You're breaking my heart, you know that," she said, her voice shaking with false emotion. I took a deep breath and tried to stay calm. I told them that I had thought long and hard about everything, and that I understood their concerns for Ryan. But I also reminded them that this house was mine, that I had worked tirelessly to get to where I was, and that I couldn't just give it away without destroying my sense of self-worth. I told them that if they truly cared about me, they would respect my decision, no matter how difficult it was. But the conversation didn't go as I had hoped. My dad became furious, shouting that I was being ridiculous and childish for not seeing reason. He accused me of being selfish and ungrateful, and my mom joined in with her tearful pleas. It was clear that they weren't going to change their minds, and I realized that I had reached an impasse. This was not a conversation about what was right or wrong, it was about power, control, and who would get their way. Things took a darker turn when my dad made a chilling threat. He told me that if I refused to give up the house, he would stop supporting me in other ways. "You won't be welcome here anymore," he said coldly. "You're on your own." It was a threat I had never expected, especially not from my father. The man who had always promised to be there for me was now giving me an ultimatum: give up the house, or face being cut off from the family. The realization hit me hard. My parents were willing to destroy our relationship over something so trivial. They didn't care about my hard work, my sacrifices, or my future, they just cared about getting what they wanted. The love and support they had once promised me felt like a distant memory now. It was clear that this wasn't just about the house, it was about their need to control me and my life. Despite the threat, I stood firm. I told them I wouldn't be coerced into giving up what was rightfully mine. My dad stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him, and my mom followed shortly after, her face twisted in anger and disbelief. I was left alone, but strangely calm. I had just faced my worst fear, and I had survived. It was painful, but I knew it was the right decision. The house might be just a building, but the fight for my autonomy was something far more important. In the days following the confrontation, the atmosphere in the family grew colder. My parents stopped contacting me, and Ryan's messages became increasingly hostile. He accused me of ruining the family and being a disappointment. The words stung, but they also solidified my decision. I couldn't let them control me any longer. I had to cut ties with them, at least for a while, in order to protect my sanity and sense of self. During this time, I leaned on the few friends I had left. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I had made the right decision. I started focusing more on myself, my work, and my life outside of the toxic grip of my family. I began to heal, slowly but surely, from the emotional wounds they had inflicted on me. But even as I moved forward, I knew the battle wasn't over. My family wasn't going to just let me go. They had already shown their true colors, and I had no idea what kind of revenge they would try to take next. But I was no longer afraid. I had stood my ground, and no matter what happened, I knew I was stronger for it. The road ahead was uncertain, but I was ready to face whatever came my way. Just when I thought I couldn't feel more alone, I received an unexpected message from Aunt Karen. She had always been more understanding than the rest of the family, and I had kept in touch with her, despite everything that had been going on. Her message was short but to the point. "I'm on your side." It was the first bit of support I had gotten in weeks, and it was like a lifeline. Aunt Karen had always been the family member who saw things clearly, and I knew she wasn't one to give in to the drama. We agreed to meet for coffee a few days later, and when we sat down together, she told me she was proud of me for standing my ground. "I know it's tough, but you're doing the right thing," she said. Aunt Karen admitted that she had always seen the way my parents treated me, how they gave Ryan preferential treatment, and how it was wrong. She confided in me that she had always wished I had stood up for myself sooner, but she understood why I hadn't. Her words gave me a sense of validation that I had desperately needed. It wasn't that I wanted to be right, it was that I wanted to be heard. Aunt Karen's support made me realize that not everyone in the family was blinded by favoritism or guilt. She told me she would help however she could, even if that meant standing up to my parents. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't fighting this battle alone. The situation took another turn when Ryan sent me a harsh ultimatum. He told me that if I didn't give him the house, he would have no choice but to expose everything to the rest of the family. The message wasn't just a threat, it was a warning. Ryan claimed that he had dirt on me, things from my past that I didn't want getting out. The sheer audacity of it took me by surprise. Ryan had always been manipulative, but this felt like a new low. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly as I read the message. What could he possibly have on me? I'd made mistakes, sure, but nothing that would shake my reputation or ruin my life. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was just another tactic to make me buckle under pressure. Ryan was desperate, and this was his last attempt at trying to gain control. I didn't respond immediately, wanting to process my feelings. But after thinking it through, I decided to take a stand. I sent him a message telling him that I wasn't afraid of his threats. If he thought he could manipulate me by bringing up my past, he was sorely mistaken. "You can try," I wrote, "but I'm not giving you what you want." That was the last time I heard from Ryan for a while. As the situation became more intense, I realized I needed to get legal advice. My parents' threats, combined with Ryan's manipulation, made it clear that this wasn't going to resolve itself peacefully. I reached out to a lawyer I had worked with in the past for some guidance. After explaining the situation, the lawyer confirmed my suspicions. My family had no legal claim to my house, and I was well within my rights to refuse their demands. The lawyer explained that while my family could try to pressure me emotionally, they couldn't take the house from me, unless I willingly signed it over. It was reassuring to hear, but also a bit disheartening. The fact that my own family could resort to such tactics made me question everything about our relationship. But at least now I had some peace of mind. If they tried anything illegal, I would have the law on my side. Armed with this knowledge, I felt more confident in standing my ground. I was no longer just fighting against my family's manipulation, I was fighting for my legal rights as well. The reality of the situation set in, and I knew it wasn't going to be easy, but I also knew that I couldn't back down. My home was my sanctuary, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. A few weeks after Ryan's ultimatum, my parents called another family meeting. This time they asked if I would be willing to meet at a neutral location, a coffee shop, of all places. The idea of meeting them again filled me with dread, but I agreed. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to settle this without further alienating everyone. When we sat down, my parents didn't waste any time. They immediately tried to appeal to my sense of guilt, talking about how much Ryan needed the house. My dad said that he had always supported me, and now it was my turn to support my brother. I sat there, listening to them repeat the same arguments they'd been making for months. But this time, I was different. I wasn't going to be swayed by their emotional manipulation. I calmly explained that I had already made my decision, and I wasn't going to change it. I reminded them that I had worked hard for my house, and that I was entitled to keep it. If they couldn't respect that, then there was nothing more to discuss. The silence that followed was thick with tension. My dad's face reddened with anger and my mom started crying. But I didn't falter. This wasn't just about the house, it was about reclaiming my autonomy, my worth. After that meeting, the family went silent. No one contacted me, not even Aunt Karen. It was like I had disappeared from their lives entirely. I spent days wondering if I had made a mistake, if I had ruined everything. But then I realized something: this wasn't a mistake. I wasn't the one who had messed up, they were. They had treated me like a pawn in their game, and I had finally stood up for myself. The silence, though painful, was also strangely liberating. Without the constant pressure from my family, I began to focus more on my own well-being. I found new hobbies, reconnected with old friends, and started to heal from the emotional turmoil of the past few months. It wasn't easy, but I knew I had made the right decision. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. But I knew the silence wouldn't last forever. My parents were too stubborn to let things go, and I wasn't naive enough to believe they would forget about the house. There was still more to come, but I was ready for whatever happened next. I had fought for my independence, and no matter how hard they tried to pull me back into their web, I wouldn't go. One evening, a knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. When I opened it, I was shocked to see Aunt Karen standing there, a bag of groceries in her hands. She had driven over to check on me, and I could see the concern in her eyes. "How are you holding up?" she asked softly as she stepped inside. We sat down together and talked about everything that had happened. Aunt Karen admitted that she hadn't known what to say for a while, but after thinking it through, she realized she couldn't just stay silent. She was on my side, and she would do whatever she could to help me stand my ground. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't alone. Aunt Karen's presence reminded me that not all of my family was toxic or manipulative. There were still people who cared, and that made all the difference. Aunt Karen offered to help me with anything I needed, from legal support to emotional encouragement. She even said that if things escalated further with my parents, she would back me up. It was a huge comfort to know that I had someone in my corner. As we talked late into the night, I began to feel a renewed sense of hope. The battle wasn't over, but I wasn't fighting it alone anymore. With Aunt Karen's support, I began to formulate a plan. I wasn't going to just wait for my family to make the next move, I was going to take charge of the situation. I decided to meet with a lawyer and explore my options for legally protecting my home. I also started reaching out to a few close friends who had been more supportive during this ordeal, asking if they could be witnesses if things ever got worse. The idea of taking legal action was intimidating, but I knew it was the right step. My family had made it clear that they were willing to go to great lengths to get what they wanted, and I wasn't about to let that happen. It was time to take control of my own future, and I wasn't going to back down now. As I made these plans, I felt more empowered than I had in a long time. I was no longer waiting for my family's approval or validation. I was taking charge of my own life, my own decisions. And with Aunt Karen's help, I knew I wasn't alone in this fight. A few weeks later, the first signs of escalation came. My parents contacted a lawyer of their own, trying to get my house through legal means. They sent me a letter demanding that I hand over the property to Ryan or face legal action. My heart sank as I read the letter. It was official now. This wasn't just a family feud. It was turning into a full-blown legal battle.
But instead of feeling defeated, I felt a sense of determination rise within me. I immediately contacted my lawyer and set up a meeting to discuss the next steps. The legal process was going to be lengthy and complicated, but I was ready for it. My lawyer assured me that I had a solid case, and that my parents' claims would likely not hold up in court.
The idea of going to court against my own family was gut-wrenching, but I knew it was the only way to protect what was mine. I couldn't let them destroy everything I had worked for, and I wasn't going to let them dictate my life anymore. The battle had become far more than just about a house. It was about reclaiming my power, my independence, and my future. As the legal battle raged on, the tension within the family reached new heights. My parents refused to back down, even after receiving my lawyer's response, which firmly outlined my rights. They were still convinced that they could win, using their emotional appeal and influence over the rest of the family. The whispers began again. Family members who hadn't picked a side yet were now siding with my parents, some claiming that I was being vindictive or ungrateful. The worst part was the way my parents began to publicly shame me. My mom told relatives that I was taking them to court over a house and accused me of prioritizing property over family. These attacks felt even more personal and malicious because they were now involving extended family members, many of whom I hadn't spoken to in years. I was now facing the impossible task of defending myself against my own family, while also dealing with the stress of a legal battle that had no end in sight. There were moments when I questioned everything. It was hard not to be consumed by doubt when the people you love the most are turning against you. But every time I thought of giving in, I remembered how far I had come and how much I had fought for this house, for my independence. I wasn't going to let them rewrite my story, no matter how many times they tried to tear me down. It hurt, but I had to stay strong. The day of the court hearing finally arrived. The nerves in my stomach were overwhelming, but I knew it was time to stand up for myself once and for all. The courthouse was intimidating, and I was shaken by the thought of sitting in front of a judge with my family on the other side, accusing me of things I had never done. But I had spent months preparing for this, and I wasn't about to back down. My lawyer reassured me that we had a solid case, but the emotional weight of it all was hard to ignore. I looked across the courtroom and saw my parents sitting with their lawyer, looking as though they were ready to win. Ryan was there too, sitting quietly with his arms crossed. I could feel the tension in the air as the proceedings began. My parents' lawyer immediately launched into their argument, painting me as a heartless individual who was depriving Ryan of a fresh start. But my lawyer was quick to counter their points. We presented the paperwork showing that I had bought the house with my own money, and that my parents had no legal claim to it. My lawyer also highlighted the emotional manipulation they had been using against me, emphasizing the toll it had taken on my mental health. It wasn't just a legal case, it was a personal one. The judge listened intently, and I felt a glimmer of hope that I might finally get the justice I deserved.
After hours of tense arguments, the judge finally called for a recess before delivering the verdict. My heart raced as I sat in the courtroom, surrounded by the hushed whispers of the onlookers. My parents sat in silence, their faces tense, while Ryan looked distant, like he was already preparing for the worst. I was trying to stay calm, but the anxiety was eating away at me. What if the judge ruled in their favor? What if I lost everything?
The judge returned to the courtroom and delivered her decision. "This court finds that the property in question is legally owned by the defendant," she said, looking directly at me. "There is no evidence to suggest that the defendant has violated any laws or contracts regarding the ownership of this property. The request for transfer of ownership to the plaintiff is denied." I sat there in stunned silence for a moment, unsure if I had actually heard the words correctly. The reality of it began to sink in. I had won. The house was mine, legally and unequivocally. It felt surreal, but as the judge wrapped up the proceedings, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. This fight was over, and I had come out victorious. The days following the court case were a mixture of relief and reflection. I was finally free from the constant battle with my family, but the emotional scars would take longer to heal. My parents tried to reach out to me after the verdict, but I couldn't bring myself to talk to them. The trust was gone, and I knew that any further contact would only be a reminder of how far they were willing to go to manipulate and control me. As for Ryan, I never heard from him again. He had no interest in reconciling, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to. The years of favoritism and manipulation had left me with a bitter taste in my mouth, and I knew that some relationships just weren't meant to be repaired. With the legal battle behind me, I started to reclaim my life. I focused on my career, my friendships, and my own well-being. I had learned so much from the experience about standing up for myself, about boundaries, and about the importance of being true to who I was. The house that had once been a source of stress and conflict became my sanctuary again, a symbol of my strength and resilience. Though my family's betrayal would always sting, I knew that I had made the right choice. I had fought for my autonomy and won, and that was something no one could ever take away from me. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years I felt hopeful and empowered. This was my life, my home, and no one was going to take that away from me again.